With Helldivers 2 coming out later this year, I thought it would be a good idea to cover one of my childhood favorites. Magicka is an isometric co-op action-adventure in the style of Diablo, with a huge focus on spellcasting and experimentation with the Romanian. This was the first game released by ArrowHeadStudios, and was for PC and Xbox 360. At the time, even with all the other multiplayer co-op games that came out in 2011, Magicka stood out on its own due to its unique magic system. On release, it was an unstable and buggy mess, but after a few years and a bunch of patches later, it's even worse. And so, before we start, we need to actually make this playable. The current Steam version crashes a lot, with multiplayer suffering the most. While not fixing everything, you can roll back your game to a more stable version. Crashes can happen, but far less frequently. Link in the description. You'll know if you did it correctly if the main menu UI changes. However, there is no fix for proper UI scaling on higher resolutions, so all the HUD elements and dialog boxes are just going to be squashed into the bottom. Without further ado, let's begin. In the land of Midgard, a genius wizard named Grimnir wanted to unify the lands through the use of ancient sealed magic. Threatened by the idea of world peace, the Order of Magic crucifies Grimnir at the end of the world, and exiled his disciples from the academy. A brief time passes, and a completely unrelated rise in monster attacks led by the orc warlord Khan threatens to engulf the lands in war. As the kingdom's problem solvers, exactly 1 to 4 wizards set out to keep the peace and keep the Order of Magic's name from being dragged in the mud. All while under the guidance of your Romanian mentor Vlad, who is definitely not a vampire. But why would you want to maintain the reputation of these lazy, bureaucratic turbo nerds who are more concerned with being baseheads and flexing their power over actually doing anything? Well, I think they get off on it. Not only are there no repercussions for deleting your allies from existence, like half of the game's conflict is caused by your character's unwillingness to actually talk to the people you sought out for help, and it somehow ends up working. Magicka. Violence solves everything. If you think that this game looks like the most generic fantasy setting this side of Tolkien, then you'd be right. Instead of trying a stylized look like other indie games at the time, Arrowhead didn't want to strain their already limited manpower trying to write up and design a unique and complicated fantasy setting. So instead, they were set on parody. By making the game not grim, dark, and serious, that would also raise the appeal to general audiences. Unfortunately, that means all the sights and everything that you fight are going to be pretty unremarkable when it comes to variety. The areas themselves are what you'd expect from a fantasy setting. Magic forests, castles, villages. No one area really stands out, and even the more out there places like the Afterlife are a bit barren. I'm not going to bring up everything because we'd be here forever, and like I said, it's clearly intentional, so keep that in mind. What does stick out are the references. You know how in some games, picking a class or a loadout informs the player about different playstyles and sometimes offers light world building? In Magicka, you can start with a 1911 dressed like Mr. White, but for real, this game is full of references. However, I want to dispel any idea that this is a playable Friedberg and Seltzer movie, because no one wants that. And even if the achievements make you think otherwise, its comedy is more in the vein of something like Nostalgaia or Unmetal. It's making fun of narrative and gameplay tropes within the genre, and not because it's trying to evoke the Penguin of Doom or something. For me, knowing this game was a student project made by a small group of college friends way back in 2008, the humor and references are a bit more endearing. But how does it play? Before we learn how to spell, we have to suit up. Literally. Each robe comes with unique equipment, and some even have passives which range from situationally useful, like having a staff with innate resistances to most elements, or complete garbage, like being immune to healing. And since this is a Paradox game, most of these are DLC. But unfortunately, the Reddit robe is free. I personally always choose the patched robe, because there's nothing more humiliating than getting shanked in the middle of the street by a walking garbage bag. Now to the core of the gameplay. Elements. On PC, you queue up elements using the keyboard, you move around with the left mouse, and you shoot with the right. You can also empty cast with no elements. There are niche uses to doing this, but it's not that great. All elements are shown in the bottom left corner, and everything you invoke will be shown under your character. By holding shift, your left click becomes a melee swing, and your right click casts any element you evoked as an AoE. But remember when I said that this was for Xbox as well? Yeah, you could play this with a controller. The left stick is for movement and aiming, but you pick elements with the right stick, and every direction is a specific element. It's no secret that because of the way that you queue up elements, using a keyboard is way faster than using a controller. Paired with the element guide being tied to clicking on the stick instead of being in the bottom corner, I can't really recommend using one for this game. Now, on the surface that seems complicated. 8 elements with 2 sub-elements, and all the other spells that I didn't even get into yet. But you don't need StarCraft level APM in order to play effectively. This game isn't very hard. Sure, in the mid-game you can give your enemies just as easy as they can give you, and even though you have the movement of a geriatric 3-legged sloth, the same can be said for your enemies. You even get a fairy companion in the single player that revives you on death. There are more than a few opportunities to experiment and get familiar with everything. Case in point, goblins. There are a lot of these little guys, and most of them have one common trait. Goblins are weak to fire. Keep them burning long enough, they panic. You can infuse fire with lightning to deal with crowds, or shoot flaming rocks for long-range harassment. Most enemies have innate weaknesses, so it's all about experimentation. It's not like you have a mana bar anyway. Even though there are recipes for certain spells, any combination of elements can be cast given that they don't cancel each other out, leading to a magic system with a lot of depth and many ways to approach situations. Cast magic landmines to disperse crowds. Shoot a shotgun blast of lightning-infused ice shards. Cast wars that make you impervious to as many elements as you can stack, including physical damage. Arse bombs. You get the idea. The spellcasting is why this game still holds up. It's like the concept of Zed's alchemy with the gameplay of Invoker. It's pretty cool. By far the coolest thing you can do in this game is weapon infusions. Instead of holding shift and casting an AoE, you melee instead, and whatever you invoked gets put on your weapon. This can come in handy because the more elements you have in reserve, the slower you become, so it's good to put a strong combination of elements on your weapon of choice, as a good backup if enemies get too close. The biggest missed opportunity is that guns don't shoot magic bullets when you infuse them, they just swing like everything else. In regards to the sound, I'll keep it brief. This is a chunky sounding game. All the elements sound distinct from one another, and every spray, projectile, and beam gives good feedback, which is important since 90% of the game you'll be spending turning the enemies into chicken nuggets. Less can be said for the music. This game isn't winning any awards for sound design, but it's serviceable. There are little touches that make me appreciate the soundtrack more than I would otherwise. Most tracks have a variant that depend on whether or not you're in combat. Have a listen. I'm not going to pretend to know what I'm talking about by calling this vertical or horizontal mixing, I just think it's neat. The last thing about sound that I'll mention is the language spoken by all the NPCs. It's apparently a mix of Swedish, Finnish, and English, and Todd Benson, the guy that voices Vlad, does a good job of hamming up his delivery and having fun with the whole thing in general. But for all the other NPCs, it can sound like the Swedish chef speaking Simlish.
Ring-a-dang, mang-a-wang-wang, crank-as-mush hovender.
Now let's talk about equipment. Despite the perspective and many references to Diablo, loot isn't that important. Staffs that give elemental immunities sound good on paper, but the existence of wards makes them underwhelming at best and completely redundant at worst. Melee weapons don't fare as well either. As the game progresses, the mobs get larger and the enemies swing harder. And being the filthy zoner that you are, you kinda don't want to be in breath-smelling distance of everything that can one-shot you. Some of the effects are pretty cool, but for every teleporting sword and infinite laser staff, most of the time, it's just okay. But despite how many enemies you'll be fighting, it's not the goblins, the hordes of beastmen, or the treants that are the problem. They're only meant to slow you down. The biggest threat is always going to be another wizard, enemy or otherwise. Enemy wizards might be limited to only a handful of elements, but they know what they're doing and they come in packs. However, since wizards have absolute mastery over specific elements, that means that they can be countered, absolutely. Clash beams with opposite elements and turn their powers against them. Turn their allies against them. Use water on a lightning mage, only for him to shock himself repeatedly, and watch as he suffers ventricular fibrillation and eventual cardiac arrest. The magical back and forth between wizards is a ton of fun, since enemy wizards are essentially a walking knowledge check. But even knowing what an enemy is capable of, the fights themselves can still be chaotic. Throw multiplayer into the mix, and it's a complete mess.
God.
Despite all the good, there are some problems, namely one. I've talked very little about the actual spells. This is because they're kind of underwhelming. Not because they're ineffective, but because every offensive spell shrinks when compared to Lightning Bolt. In a game where you can create elementals, rain meteors, summon death, and give enemies blue screens that delete them from the game, what's so good about Lightning Bolt? Is it a secret endgame spell designed to give you a power trip? No. You get this in the 3rd chapter, in a little over an hour of gameplay. Since the early game only has you playing around with a handful of spells, the one that can insta-gib enemies is going to be your go-to for a while. And if you can nail the muscle memory to spam it, the casting animation is so quick that it can reliably deal with bigger crowds of enemies. It comparably doesn't require as many elements to cast. The sub-element is at the start of the recipe instead of being in the middle like other spells, and by the time you get more complicated spells with longer recipes, most people will try the new spell, see that it doesn't turn them into paste fast enough, and then relapse into their crippling lightning bolt addiction. When everything is broken, the best spell is the easiest one to cast, and comes with no risk to the caster. It can chunk every mob in the game, has limited CC, and can even open doors. The devs proclaim that spells are balanced due to them causing friendly fire. Counter-argument: multiple people spamming lightning bolt. There's no longer a threat if I'm the last one standing. You might think that the inability to cast it inside would be its biggest weakness, but the gorilla thinks otherwise. And not only is it the best damaging spell in the game, it's a gateway drug for the best beam in the game. Steam has some of the highest DPS out of all the elements when stacked, and since it makes enemies wet, any electric damage they take is doubled. Electricity and steam don't cancel each other out, so they're perfect for a beam. And frozen targets take 3 times the damage from all sources. Combine it all and you can dominate almost anything. So what's stopping you from just using one combination of elements or one spell for the whole game? Well, it's boring. Half of the fun is experimenting with how the elements interact with the enemies in the environment. Trying out different methods to deal with your enemies keeps the combat fresh. And like I mentioned with the Lightning Mage, it's fun to find counters in a way that doesn't involve using the same method over and over again. This is a fun, stupid game that's not very long. And there really isn't anything in the base game that requires you to be a total sweatlord. And remember what I said earlier, not every spell is straight up useless. While other spells might not give you the same dopamine hit as Lightning Bolt, there is nothing like having a plan come together due to good timing. There's no denying that the magic is broken, but that's the point. Magicka was a game made by a small team that had a good idea, ran with it, and did their best to have fun with their world. And I did too. I am, however, less forgiving with the DLC, because this is where Pisces Interactive took over. While bringing multiple friends is recommended to have more fun in the base game, it feels like you're required to bring multiple people into the DLC. The encounters are way more difficult due to the sheer amount of enemies, and as a result, I end up relying on the same element combination over and over just to not get overwhelmed, going against why I like this game to begin with. Some might say skill issue, but I say the spells you obtain are limited, there are a lot of mobs in tight places, and Nullify. On top of removing all barriers, traps, and status effects, Nullify clears up all the elements you have queued up, and with how often they spam it, you'll either die by the enemies or from a seizure. For a majority of the DLC campaigns, there are no chapters like in the base game, so if your game crashes, you'll have to start all over again, with the most notorious being Dungeons and Demons. The ending gauntlet can be a bit of a pain for one person. The mobs are gonna tear you apart, but that's not even the worst part. It's the boss fight. The Butcher from Diablo 1 is the hardest boss in Magicka. He has insta-gib swings that make you want to keep your distance, which can be difficult due to the movement slowing grease that can flood the screen with fire when he ignites them with his flaming stomp. This stomp can also knock you down and keep you in place, leaving you vulnerable when he decides to charge attack you, closing the distance. This is a fight that discourages you from keeping in one place, and so you're always on the move. If that wasn't enough, we got ads. You're supposed to lead him into these saw pillars that shave down his health, but even if you make him run into all 4, you still gotta do enough damage fast enough so that he doesn't recover, all while reapplying fire wards so that you don't burn alive. And I only beat him because the game felt pity on me or something. Like after an hour of fighting this guy, he just decides to peace out and instant transmission out of there. What I don't understand is that the next piece of DLC is a continuation of this story. So why do they have to sell it in 2 parts when a year earlier they sold the DLC campaign with more content and multiple chapters? But enough negativity. Because despite all my hangups, and from my biased perspective, even 11 years later, I still hold this game in high regard, glitches and all. And even though I enjoyed most of this game because of the gameplay, it can be hard to recommend to most people nowadays. With it being so generic and most of the standout aspects are references to other things, it kinda lacks an identity, which can turn people off. I recommend this game, but with a word of caution. Get it if you have some friends to play it with, but the network bugs and the crashes make this game way more frustrating than it has to be. If you really want it, then get it on a sale. Thanks for dropping by. If you liked the video, then hit all the buttons. If you didn't, then let me know in the comments. Stay tuned next time for when I play Legend of Grimrock meets God Hand. Hopefully soon. Take care.